How does an empire that believed itself divinely protected come to terms with instant annihilation? Not through gradual defeat or overwhelming invasion, but through two blinding flashes that changed the nature of warfare forever. This is the story of how the atomic bombs didn't just destroy two cities, they shattered an entire worldview in a matter of days. For the Japanese military and civilians who experienced August 1945, the transformation from absolute certainty in ultimate victory to complete surrender happened so fast that many simply couldn't process it. They had been prepared to fight to the last person, to defend every inch of sacred soil with bamboo spears if necessary. Then came weapons they couldn't even comprehend. What happened in those 72 hours between Hiroshima and the Emperor's surrender broadcast wasn't just military defeat. It was the collapse of everything the Japanese people had been told about their place in the universe, their emperor's divine nature, and their nation's inevitable triumph. The atomic bombs didn't just end the war, they ended an entire way of understanding the world. To understand the shock, you must first understand what the Japanese believed in August 1945. Despite losing battle after battle across the Pacific, despite the firebombing that had destroyed 64 Japanese cities, despite starvation spreading through the home islands, most Japanese still believed victory was possible. Not through superior weapons or tactics, but through Yamato Damashi, the unique Japanese spirit that could overcome any material disadvantage. This wasn't mere propaganda. It was a worldview built over centuries, reinforced by the kamikaze divine winds that had saved Japan from Mongol invasion, by the stunning victory over Russia in 1905, by the rapid conquest of much of Asia. Japanese soldiers and civilians alike believed that their spiritual superiority, their willingness to die for the emperor, their unique place as descendants of the sun goddess Amaterasu, would ultimately triumph over American material wealth. School children practiced with bamboo spears daily, learning to thrust at the vital points of American soldiers. Women trained to fight with naginata pole weapons and awls. Old men prepared to become human bombs, strapping explosives to their bodies. The entire population of 100 million was ready to die as one, believing this ultimate sacrifice would somehow produce victory or at least prevent the desecration of the sacred homeland. The military had concrete plans for this final battle. Operation Ketsu-Go called for every remaining aircraft to become a kamikaze weapon, every boat a suicide craft, every soldier and civilian a human bullet aimed at the invaders. They had hidden thousands of planes in caves and camouflaged revetments. They had stockpiled ceramic grenades and bamboo spears. They had prepared to turn the invasion beaches into massive killing fields, where American blood would flow so freely that surely the enemy would lose heart and negotiate. Consider Lieutenant Colonel Masao Inaba, a staff officer at the War Ministry in Tokyo. On the morning of August 6, 1945, he was reviewing plans for Operation Ketsu-Go, the massive defense of the homeland that would throw 28 million civilians and every remaining soldier against the American invaders. The plans called for turning beaches into killing fields, cities into fortresses, and if necessary, the entire population into a 100 million-person suicide squad. Inaba believed, as did most of the military leadership, that Japanese spiritual strength would overcome American material advantage. The morning of August 6th began like any other wartime day in Tokyo. At the War Ministry, officers continued refining their defense plans. They calculated that the Americans had lost the stomach for heavy casualties after Okinawa, where kamikaze attacks and fanatical ground resistance had killed 12,000 Americans. If they could inflict 10 times those casualties during the invasion, surely America would negotiate rather than continue the slaughter. These weren't desperate fantasies, but careful calculations. The Japanese had correctly identified the American landing beaches on Kyushu. They had positioned their forces accordingly. They knew the Americans planned to invade in November. They had months to prepare. Every detail was considered, from the placement of underwater obstacles to the timing of suicide attacks. The plans even included using schoolgirls as human mines, their bodies packed with explosives to throw themselves under American tanks. In this atmosphere of grim determination, The first reports from Hiroshima seemed impossible. Around 10:30 that morning, confused messages began arriving at the ministry. Communication with Hiroshima had ceased after reports of a tremendous explosion. A single enemy plane had been observed. Then nothing. The reports made no tactical sense. How could one plane cause such destruction? Lieutenant Colonel Inaba and his colleagues gathered around the radio, trying to make sense of fragmentary reports. Some witnesses described a blinding flash that turned the sky white. Others spoke of a massive mushroom-shaped cloud rising miles into the sky. Still, others reported that the entire center of Hiroshima had simply vanished. These accounts seemed hysterical, impossible. Perhaps it was a new type of incendiary bomb, they reasoned, or maybe multiple bombs dropped simultaneously to create the illusion of a single massive explosion. That afternoon, confused reports began arriving from Hiroshima. A single bomb had destroyed the entire city center. Communications had ceased. The reports made no sense. Inaba and his colleagues assumed it was propaganda, or at worst, a massive conventional raid being exaggerated. No single bomb could destroy a city. Their own scientists had told them atomic weapons, while theoretically possible, would take years to develop and massive resources to produce. The Japanese military wasn't completely ignorant about atomic weapons. They had their own nuclear research programs, both Army and Navy sponsored. The Army's NEGO project and the Navy's FGO project had been working since 1943 to develop an atomic bomb. But their scientists, including Dr. Yoshio Nishina, who had studied with Niels Bohr, had concluded that the technical challenges were insurmountable during wartime. The biggest obstacle was producing fissionable material. Japan's physicists calculated that separating enough uranium-235 would require 1/10 of Japan's entire electrical output and 10 years of work. As for plutonium, Japan lacked the massive reactors necessary for production. Based on these calculations, military leaders assumed the Americans faced similar constraints. Even if the United States had managed to build one atomic bomb, surely they couldn't have more than that. The resources required were simply too vast. This miscalculation would prove fatal. What the Japanese didn't know was that the Manhattan Project had employed over 130,000 workers, had cost $2 billion, more than the entire Japanese war budget, and had built massive facilities covering hundreds of square miles. The Americans hadn't built just one bomb. They had created an entire atomic bomb production system. But on August 6th, Japanese leaders clung to their assumptions. Admiral Seimu Toyoda, chief of the Naval General Staff, declared that even if it was an atomic bomb, the Americans could have at most 2 or 3, and they wouldn't waste them all on Japan. General Yoshijiro Umezu, Army Chief of Staff, went further. He doubted it was an atomic bomb at all, insisting on sending investigators to determine what had really happened. As evening fell on August 6th, a clearer picture began emerging. Reconnaissance flights over Hiroshima reported something unprecedented. The city wasn't just damaged, it had been erased. Where hundreds of thousands of people had lived that morning, there was now a flat, burned plain. The few structures still standing were hollow shells, their windows blown out, their walls cracked, standing like tombstones in a graveyard that stretched for miles. But as the hours passed, the reports grew more disturbing. Pilots flying over Hiroshima described something unprecedented. Where a city of 350,000 people had stood that morning, there was now just scorched earth and rubble extending for miles. The few communications that trickled out spoke of a blinding flash brighter than the sun, people vaporized where they stood, shadows burned into walls, and a strange sickness affecting survivors. The Japanese military's atomic research program had educated top officials about nuclear fission. They knew the theoretical possibilities, but also the immense difficulties. Dr. Yoshio Nishina, Japan's leading nuclear physicist, had calculated that even the United States, with all its resources, could not possibly have produced enough fissionable material for more than one bomb, if that. This assessment would prove catastrophically wrong, but it shaped the initial response. The Navy High Command issued a statement that even if the Americans had used an atomic bomb, they couldn't have more, and even if they did, they wouldn't be that powerful. In Hiroshima itself, the reality defied all comprehension. 20-year-old bank clerk Akiko Takakura was just 260 meters from ground zero when the bomb detonated at 8:15 that morning. She saw a white magnesium flash, then nothing. When she regained consciousness, she was trapped under debris, her back lacerated by over 100 wounds. Crawling out, she encountered a scene from hell. People walked like ghosts, their skin hanging off in sheets. A soldier sat holding, his intestines in his hands. Bodies floated in the river, so many that she could have walked across on them. What Takakura witnessed went beyond conventional warfare. She saw fingers spontaneously combusting, the fire spreading up arms to consume entire bodies. Human beings turned into living torches. The heat was so intense that people's eyes had melted and run down their faces. Birds ignited in mid-flight and fell from the sky as balls of fire. This wasn't warfare as anyone understood it. It was like the sun itself had touched the earth. The testimonies of other survivors painted an equally incomprehensible picture. 14-year-old Akihiro Takahashi was standing in line with his classmates 1.4 kilometers from the hypocenter. The flash threw him to the ground. When he stood up, his clothes were in tatters, his skin hanging from his body like rags. He stumbled toward the river, passing people whose faces had melted, leaving only their teeth visible. Some walked holding their own eyeballs in their hands. Others crawled, leaving trails of flesh behind them. At the Red Cross hospital, Dr. Michihiko Hachiya had been thrown across his room by the blast. Bleeding from multiple wounds, he made his way to the hospital to find it overwhelmed. Patients arrived with burns unlike anything he had seen, their skin peeling off at the slightest touch. Many who seemed uninjured died within hours, vomiting blood, their hair falling out in clumps. He had no explanation for these symptoms. No medical training had prepared him for radiation sickness. Reverend Kiyoshi Tanimoto, who had been outside the city when the bomb fell, rushed back to help. He found the Hiroshima he knew had vanished. Where busy streets had been, there was only rubble and ash. The rivers were clogged with bodies, so many that the water had turned red. People begged for water, but when he gave it to them, they died immediately. He spent days carrying the wounded on his back, many dying before. He could get them to help. 6-year-old Shoso Kawamoto was eating breakfast when the world exploded. The blast threw him against a wall, embedding glass in his body. His mother pulled him from the wreckage of their home, her face so burned he didn't recognize her. Together they stumbled through a city that no longer existed, passing shadows burned into walls where people had been vaporized, leaving only their silhouettes as monuments to their final moment. The scale of destruction overwhelmed any attempt at comprehension. The Shima Hospital, directly under the explosion, had simply ceased to exist. Its patients and staff vaporized instantly. The Hiroshima Castle, which had stood for 350 years, was gone. Buddhist temples, Shinto shrines, schools, homes, all had been reduced to radioactive ash in less than a second. 15-year-old Teiko Terame was mobilized for labor service when the bomb struck. She didn't realize the extent of her injuries until days later when she found a mirror. Her left eye had been destroyed, resembling a pomegranate, with cuts across her face transforming her appearance into something she described as monstrous. Like thousands of others, she had been turned from a normal teenager into a hibakusha, an explosion-affected person, in an instant. The psychological impact rippled outward from Hiroshima. Civilians who had endured months of conventional bombing, who had steeled themselves for invasion, suddenly faced something beyond their mental framework. You could hide from regular bombs in shelters. You could fight soldiers with bamboo spears if it came to that. But how do you fight a weapon that turns an entire city into ash in seconds? On August 7th, as Japan struggled to understand what had happened, President Truman's announcement reached Japanese leaders. He claimed America possessed a new bomb harnessing the basic power of the universe, the force from which the sun draws its power. He warned of a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which had never been seen on Earth. Most Japanese officials dismissed this as propaganda. Surely the Americans were exaggerating. One bomb, even a powerful one, couldn't change the course of the war. The Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, Japan's 6 most powerful leaders, met on August 9th to discuss Hiroshima. The Big Six, as they were known, included Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, War Minister General Korechika Anami, Navy Minister Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, Army Chief of Staff General Yoshijiro Umezu, and Navy Chief of Staff Admiral Somu Toyoda. They were still debating whether it had really been an atomic bomb when the second piece of devastating news arrived. The meeting had been delayed from August 7th because the military members wanted more information. They still couldn't believe a single bomb had destroyed Hiroshima. General Anami argued it might have been a massive conventional raid combined with propaganda. Admiral Toyoda suggested it was a special type of mine, or perhaps several bombs dropped to appear as one explosion. They grasped at any explanation except the truth that America had achieved what Japan's own scientists said was impossible. Foreign Minister Togo tried to inject reality into the discussion. He had received reports from Swiss and Swedish diplomats confirming the destruction. President Truman's statement had been clear. America possessed atomic bombs and would continue dropping them until Japan surrendered. But even Togo couldn't fully grasp what this meant. No one could. The very concept of a weapon that could destroy an entire city in seconds was outside human experience. The debate was still raging when the first catastrophe of August 9th struck. At 1 minute past midnight that same day, Soviet forces had launched a massive invasion of Manchuria. The Soviets, who Japan had desperately hoped would mediate a negotiated peace, had instead joined their enemies. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers were pouring across the border, smashing through the Kwantung army that Japan had once considered invincible. The neutral party Japan had counted on for salvation had become another enemy seeking their destruction. This Soviet betrayal shattered one of Japan's last hopes. For months, Japanese diplomats had been secretly approaching the Soviets, offering territorial concessions in exchange for mediation with the Americans. The Japanese ambassador in Moscow had been instructed to offer the Soviets anything they wanted, Sakhalin, the Kurils, even Manchuria itself, if they would just help negotiate peace. Unknown to the Japanese, the Soviets had been planning this invasion since the Yalta Conference in February and had been lying to Japanese diplomats while secretly moving massive forces to the Manchurian border. The Soviet invasion was a masterpiece of military deception and overwhelming force. In less than a week, they would destroy the Kwantung Army, Japan's largest and once most elite force. The same army that had conquered Manchuria and terrorized China was being swept aside like toy soldiers. Tank corps penetrated hundreds of miles, paratroopers seized key cities, and the entire Japanese position in mainland Asia collapsed overnight. The meeting was still in session when, at 11:02 in the morning, news arrived that shattered their remaining assumptions. Nagasaki had just been hit by a second atomic bomb. Another city of 263,000 people had been obliterated. The Americans hadn't just had one miracle weapon, they had an arsenal. Everything the Japanese military had calculated about American capabilities was wrong. The second bomb destroyed more than Nagasaki. It destroyed the last argument of the military hardliners. They had insisted the Americans couldn't have more than one atomic bomb. Now they had 2. How many more did they have? 3? 10? 100? The Japanese had no way of knowing that America had no more bombs ready, that the third wouldn't be available until August 19th. All they knew was that cities could now disappear daily until nothing remained of Japan but radioactive ash. In Nagasaki, the devastation repeated Hiroshima's horror with variations. The bomb had detonated over the Urakami Valley, the center of Japanese Christianity. The massive Urakami Cathedral, the largest Christian church in East Asia, was reduced to rubble. Of the 12,000 Catholics in the valley, 8,000 died instantly. The city's medical infrastructure, including most doctors and nurses, ceased to exist in a flash. The bomb had actually missed its intended target. Kokura had been the primary objective, but smoke and clouds had obscured the city. The B-29 boxcar, running low on fuel, had diverted to Nagasaki. Even there, clouds covered the city, and bombardier Kermit Beahan had only seconds to identify a target through a brief break in the clouds. The bomb exploded over the Mitsubishi armaments factory, but hills partially shielded other parts of the city, limiting the destruction compared to Hiroshima. Still, 40,000 died instantly, with tens of thousands more dying in the following months. Among the victims was a man who would become famous as the unluckiest person in history. Tsutomu Yamaguchi, a 29-year-old engineer, had been in Hiroshima on business when the first bomb fell. Despite severe burns and ruptured eardrums, he had managed to return home to Nagasaki. On August 9th, he was describing the Hiroshima bombing to his supervisor, who accused him of being crazy for claiming one bomb had destroyed an entire city. At that moment, the second atomic bomb detonated 3 kilometers away. Yamaguchi survived again, the only person officially recognized as surviving both atomic bombings. Yamaguchi's experience embodied the incomprehensible nature of atomic warfare. He had seen Hiroshima vanish, had his body burned by radiation, had witnessed hell itself. Yet when he tried to explain it, even his own supervisor couldn't believe him. The human mind simply couldn't accept that such destruction was possible. Then, in the middle of his explanation, it happened again. Reality had become more terrifying than any nightmare. In the Mitsubishi torpedo factory, hundreds of workers were vaporized at their stations. At the Nagasaki Medical College, students and professors died instantly in their classrooms. The Chinsei Middle School lost 500 students in a second. Unlike Hiroshima, where many were caught completely by surprise, Nagasaki had received an air raid warning, but it had been called off. People had left their shelters, returned to work, resumed their daily lives. Then the sky exploded. For ordinary Japanese, the psychological shock was complete. In the countryside, farmer's wife Tomiko Higa heard the emperor's surrender speech 6 days later. Until that moment, she had believed Japan was winning. The government had told them victory was certain, that American forces were being crushed, that divine winds would protect Japan as they had against the Mongols centuries before. The atomic bombs revealed all of it as lies. The military response split between denial and determination to fight on. Vice Admiral Takijiro Onishi, founder of the Kamikaze Corps, argued that Japan would never be defeated if they were prepared to sacrifice 20 million lives in special attacks. He believed the Americans couldn't have many more atomic bombs and that Japanese spirit could still prevail. General Anami insisted the military could still inflict such casualties on an American invasion that they could negotiate better terms. But Emperor Hirohito had reached a different conclusion. Meeting with Foreign Minister Togo on the afternoon of August 8th, before the Nagasaki bombing, he had already decided the war must end. The atomic bomb had given him the tool he needed, a face-saving reason to surrender. Japan couldn't be expected to fight weapons that harnessed the fundamental forces of the universe. It wasn't a defeat of Japanese spirit, but a matter of transcendent technology. The emperor's decision triggered the most dramatic hours in Japanese history. Just before midnight on August 9th, he convened an imperial conference in the underground bomb shelter beneath the palace. Breaking all precedent, he personally intervened in the debate. He spoke of the discrepancy between military plans and performance, the devastating power of the atomic bombs, and ominously, the domestic situation, referring to the danger of internal revolution as starving civilians reached their breaking point. Major Kenji Hatanaka, a young staff officer, represented those who couldn't accept surrender. On the night of August 14th, he led a coup attempt to prevent the emperor's surrender broadcast. With a group of officers, he murdered Lieutenant General Takeshi Mori, commander of the Imperial Guard, and used his seal to forge orders occupying the palace. They spent hours searching for the recording of the emperor's surrender speech, determined to prevent its broadcast. Hatanaka's coup represented the final convulsion of Japanese militarism. He and his fellow conspirators, including Lieutenant Colonels Masataka Ida and Jiro Shiozaki, believed that surrender meant not just defeat but the destruction of Japan's essence. They couldn't accept that the emperor, whom they worshipped as a living god, would choose surrender over death. In their minds, they were saving the emperor from traitors who had deceived him. The coup had been brewing since August 10th, when word leaked that the emperor was considering surrender. War Minister Anami, torn between loyalty to the emperor and his belief in continued resistance, had given ambiguous signals to the plotters. He neither endorsed nor firmly rejected their plans, telling them to follow their conscience. This ambiguity emboldened them, while leaving Anami room to deny involvement if they failed. The rebels cut phone lines, detained palace staff, and threatened to disembowel the emperor's aide with a samurai sword if he didn't reveal where the recording was hidden. They ransacked the palace's labyrinthine corridors, while American B-29s flew overhead on what would be the last bombing raid of the war. The recording, meanwhile, was hidden in a pile of documents, labelled innocuously and smuggled out in a lunch bag. The search became increasingly desperate as dawn approached. Hatanaka personally interrogated Marquis Kido, the Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, threatening him with death. He searched the emperor's own quarters, an act of sacrilege that showed how far the rebels had fallen into confusion. They couldn't find the recording because Palace Chamberlain Yoshihiro Tokugawa had hidden it in a safe used for the imperial regalia, a place so sacred the rebels didn't think to search. As the hours passed, support for the coup evaporated. General Shizuichi Tanaka, commander of the Eastern District Army, arrived at the palace and berated the rebels for dishonoring the army. Other senior officers who had initially sympathized with the coup's goals refused to provide troops. The rebels realized they were alone, that the army would not rise up to prevent surrender. As dawn broke on August 15th, the coup collapsed. The Eastern District Army refused to support the rebels. Hatanaka went to the NHK radio station, waving a pistol, desperately trying to get airtime to explain his actions to the Japanese people. Refused and dishonored, he rode through Tokyo streets on a motorcycle, throwing leaflets explaining his motives, before shooting himself in front of the imperial palace. His death poem was found in his pocket, speaking of his desire to save Japan from dishonor. Lieutenant Colonel Shiozaki followed him in death, committing seppuku on the palace grounds. War Minister Anami, who had failed to prevent either the surrender or the coup, also committed ritual suicide, his death poem apologizing for his great crime. Across Japan, other officers who couldn't accept defeat followed their example. Vice Admiral Onishi, father of the kamikaze, slit his belly and refused medical aid, taking 15 hours to die in agony as penance for the young men he had sent to their deaths. At noon on August 15th, Japanese citizens gathered around radios, many wearing their finest clothes for what they were told would be an announcement of the highest importance. Most expected to hear a call for final resistance, for every Japanese to die gloriously defending the homeland. Instead, they heard the emperor's voice for the first time in history, speaking in formal court Japanese many could barely understand. The emperor never used the word surrender. He spoke of accepting the joint declaration of the powers. He mentioned the war situation developing not necessarily to Japan's advantage, a masterpiece of understatement. But crucially, he cited the cruel bombs whose damage was beyond measure. Continuing to fight would lead not only to the collapse of the Japanese nation, but the extinction of human civilization itself. The imperial voice, thin and high-pitched, shocked listeners as much as his words. This was the voice of God? He sounded human, fragile, mortal. Many Japanese had never heard a radio before, gathered around the few receivers in their villages. The static, the formal language, the poor audio quality meant many didn't fully understand what they were hearing. Some thought the emperor was calling for greater resistance. Others simply couldn't process that Japan had surrendered. In Tokyo, people fell to their knees and wept. In Nagano Prefecture, schoolteacher Saburo Takei watched his students collapse in confusion. They had been training with bamboo spears that very morning, preparing to kill Americans on the beaches. Now they were being told to bear the plough, unbearable, and endure the unendurable. Some felt relief that they would live. Others felt shame that they wouldn't die gloriously. Many felt nothing, their minds unable to process such a complete reversal of everything they believed. 16-year-old Yukiko Kasai had been working in a munitions factory, making bullets for the final battle. When the Emperor's broadcast ended, the factory manager addressed the workers. He told them Japan had developed its own atomic bomb and would now destroy America. It took days for the truth to sink in, that Japan had not only lost but surrendered unconditionally. The manager had lied because he couldn't accept the truth himself. Across Japan, reactions varied wildly. In some military units, officers smashed radios and insisted the broadcast was American propaganda. In Atsugi airfield, kamikaze pilots threatened to continue attacking the American fleet until forcibly restrained. In contrast, many civilians felt secret relief. The mother who had been preparing to kill her children rather than let them be captured by Americans put down the knife. The father who had been teaching his son to thrust a bamboo spear at American soldiers told him they would live. The confusion was amplified because most Japanese had no idea how badly the war had been going. Censorship had hidden the truth about the devastating losses across the Pacific. They didn't know the Navy had been destroyed, that most of Japan's conquered territory had been retaken, that millions of Japanese soldiers were cut off and starving on bypassed islands. They still believed Japan was winning. Now suddenly, incomprehensibly, Japan had surrendered because of a new type of bomb. For millions of Japanese, this moment shattered their entire worldview. The emperor, whom they had been taught was a living god descended from the sun goddess, was admitting defeat. The divine protection they had counted on had failed. The special attack spirit that was supposed to overcome any material disadvantage had proven powerless against atomic weapons. Schoolteacher Saburo Nishimoto in Nagano Prefecture watched his students break down in tears. They had been training to fight the Americans with bamboo spears, absolutely certain they would die gloriously for the emperor. Now they were being told to live, to endure the unendurable. Some felt relief, others shame, many simply confusion. How could everything they believed be wrong? The atomic bomb's psychological impact extended beyond Japan's surrender. Dr. Michihiko Hachiya, director of the Hiroshima Communications Hospital, kept a diary of the aftermath. He recorded not just the medical horrors, the radiation sickness that killed people who seemed uninjured, the infections that wouldn't heal, but also the spiritual devastation. Survivors walked through the ruins, asking why they had lived when so many died. They felt guilt for surviving, shame for Japan's defeat, and terror of the invisible poison they carried in their bodies. The hibakusha faced discrimination even from other Japanese. People feared radiation was contagious. Marriage proposals were withdrawn when families learned someone had been in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Employers refused to hire survivors. Children of hibakusha were assumed to be genetically damaged. The bombs had not only ended the war but created a permanent underclass of citizens marked by atomic fire. American occupation forces arriving in Japan found a population in psychological shock. General MacArthur noted that the Japanese people seemed to have experienced a complete transformation almost overnight. The same civilians who had been training to fight with sharpened bamboo poles now welcomed American soldiers. The military that had fought fanatically for every island now laid down their arms without resistance. But this transformation came at immense psychological cost. Writer Kenzaburo Oe later described it as the death of the old Japan and the traumatic birth of a new one. The atomic bombs had done more than defeat Japan militarily. They had invalidated an entire belief system, proved that spiritual strength meant nothing against scientific power, and shown that the emperor was just a man whose voice could barely be heard over a radio. The speed of Japan's psychological transformation was unprecedented. In less than 2 weeks, the nation went from preparing every citizen to die in a final battle to complete acceptance of occupation. The atomic bombs had achieved something military invasion might never have accomplished: the instant shattering of Japanese military ideology. Lieutenant Colonel Masao Inaba, who had been planning the homeland's defense on August 6th, found himself on August 15th listening to the emperor call for surrender. In his diary, he wrote that it felt like the world had turned upside down. Everything he had believed, everything he had told his soldiers, had been proven false by two bombs. The Americans hadn't needed to invade. They could destroy Japan from the air, city by city, without losing a single soldier. This was the unique horror of atomic weapons that struck the Japanese so forcefully. Conventional bombing, however terrible, was still comprehensible as warfare. Soldiers dropped bombs, other soldiers shot back, civilians took shelter. But atomic bombs removed even the pretense of combat. They were not weapons of war, but instruments of annihilation. There was no defense, no counterattack, no honorable death in battle, just instant obliteration or slow death from radiation. The Japanese military's reaction split between those who accepted the new reality and those who couldn't. Admiral Toyoda and General Umezu had argued even after Nagasaki that Japan should continue fighting. They believed the Americans had exhausted their atomic arsenal and that conventional defense could still exact a terrible price. They were wrong about the arsenal, though right that the Americans had no more bombs immediately ready. A third would have been available by August 19th. For the scientists who had worked on Japan's own atomic program, the bombs brought a different kind of shock. Dr. Nishina flew to Hiroshima to investigate and confirmed it had indeed been an atomic bomb. His calculations about American capabilities had been catastrophically wrong. The Americans had not only built atomic bombs, but had enough confidence in their supply to use 2 within 3 days. Japan's entire strategic assessment had been based on false assumptions. The psychological impact reached even Japanese forces overseas, who hadn't experienced the bombs directly. In Manchuria, soldiers who had been preparing to fight to the death against the Soviets suddenly received orders to surrender. Many couldn't believe it. Some units initially refused, certain the orders were American propaganda. It took personal representatives from the Emperor to convince overseas commanders that surrender was real. The atomic bombs also shattered Japanese assumptions about American psychology. They had believed Americans were too soft, too attached to material comfort, to match Japanese warrior spirit. The ruthlessness of atomic bombing proved otherwise. The Americans had been willing to vaporize entire cities of civilians. This wasn't the behavior of a soft enemy, but of one capable of unlimited destruction. Japanese civilians experienced a kind of collective dissociation. Everything they had been told by their government for years had been proven false in days. They had been told Japan was winning while cities burned. They had been told 100 million would die together while leaders negotiated surrender. They had been told the Emperor was divine while he admitted defeat on the radio. The revelation about atomic weapons merged with other shocks. Returning soldiers told of American material abundance they had been ordered to keep secret. Prisoners of war came back, describing American camps where they ate better than Japanese civilians. The atomic bombs became part of a broader narrative of deception and defeat. For the hibakusha, the psychological trauma was unique and lasting. Unlike other war survivors who could at least understand what had happened to them, atomic bomb survivors faced something unprecedented. They suffered from what psychiatrists would later term atomic bomb neurosis, a combination of survivor guilt, health anxiety, and social stigma that persisted for decades. Children who survived carried particular psychological scars. 8-year-old Sadako Sasaki seemed healthy after the Hiroshima bombing but developed leukemia 9 years later. Her attempt to fold 1,000 paper cranes before dying became a symbol of the bomb's long reach. Children who lost entire families became atomic orphans, growing up with a special hatred for the adults who had led Japan to war. The Japanese government's response to the psychological crisis was suppression. During the occupation, American censors prohibited detailed reporting about the bomb's effects. Japanese officials, once independence was restored, preferred to focus on reconstruction rather than dwelling on atomic trauma. The hibakusha's testimonies were marginalized, their suffering treated as an embarrassment to Japan's economic miracle. This enforced silence created its own psychological damage. Survivors couldn't properly process their trauma. The Japanese public couldn't fully understand what had happened. It wasn't until decades later that the full psychological impact of the atomic bombs began to be acknowledged and studied. Yet from this psychological devastation came an unexpected transformation. Japan's complete defeat and the shock of atomic weapons created space for radical change. The same population that had been preparing for suicidal resistance embraced pacifism. The military that had dominated Japanese society for decades was disbanded. The emperor became a symbolic priome, figure touring factories and schools. Psychologist Robert Lifton, studying hibakusha decades later, found that many had transformed their trauma into a mission for peace. They became living witnesses to atomic horror, traveling the world to testify about what nuclear weapons really meant. Their psychological wounds became a warning to humanity. The atomic bomb's psychological impact extended beyond Japan. For the first time in history, humans possessed the power to destroy civilization. The Japanese experience became a global trauma, a preview of what nuclear war meant. The images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the testimonies of survivors, the shadows burned into walls, entered humanity's collective nightmare. The speed of transformation was what made it so psychologically devastating. Other nations had suffered defeat in World War II. France had fallen in 6 weeks, but that was still a conventional military campaign with battles, retreats, and negotiations. The atomic bombs compressed total defeat into milliseconds. There was no process of coming to terms with loss, no gradual realization of defeat. One moment, Japan was preparing for the final battle. The next moment, 2 cities had vanished, and the emperor was surrendering. For the scientists who had worked on Japan's atomic programs, the shock was particularly acute. Dr. Nishina flew to Hiroshima on August 8 to investigate. Using primitive detection equipment, he confirmed the presence of radioactivity. His measurements proved it had indeed been an atomic bomb. The implications devastated him. Everything he had calculated about the difficulty of producing fissionable material was wrong. The Americans hadn't just built 1 or 2 bombs, they had mastered mass production of atomic weapons. Lieutenant Commander Haruki Iki of the Imperial Navy's atomic program felt a different kind of shock. He had assured naval leadership that atomic bombs were theoretically possible, but practically impossible during wartime. Now he had to explain how the Americans had achieved the impossible. The truth was that Japan's entire scientific and industrial base had been inadequate. They lacked the electrical power, the industrial capacity, the raw materials, and most importantly, the organizational ability to coordinate such a massive project. Japanese culture processed the atomic trauma through art, literature, and film. Godzilla, emerging from the sea as a radioactive monster, embodied atomic anxiety. Manga and anime explored themes of apocalyptic destruction and rebirth. The bombs became a rupture in Japanese history, dividing everything into before and after. The psychological shock also shaped Japan's post-war identity. The only nation to suffer atomic attack became committed to nuclear abolition. The warriors who had fought fanatically became advocates for peace. The divine emperor became a marine biologist. It was as if the atomic bombs had reversed the polarity of Japanese society. In the immediate aftermath, the psychological damage was often hidden. Japanese culture emphasized gaman, enduring the seemingly unbearable with patience and dignity. Survivors didn't speak of their trauma. They returned to destroyed cities and began rebuilding. They buried their dead and went back to work. But beneath this stoic surface, the psychological wounds festered. Children who survived carried unique psychological scars. They had been taught that the emperor was God, that Japan was invincible, that they would die gloriously for the nation. Then they watched their classmates vaporize, their teachers melt, their parents disappear in atomic fire. The trauma of witnessing such incomprehensible destruction at a young age left permanent marks on their psyche. Children who lost entire families became atomic orphans, growing up with a special hatred for the adults who had led Japan to war. Many survivors experienced what psychiatrists would later term atomic bomb neurosis. They suffered from survivor guilt, wondering why they lived when so many died. They experienced constant anxiety about their health, interpreting every symptom as the beginning of radiation sickness. They faced discrimination from other Japanese who feared radiation was contagious, who wouldn't marry them or hire them. The bombs had marked them as different, tainted, dangerous. Japanese culture processed the atomic trauma through art, literature, and film. Godzilla, emerging from the sea as a radioactive monster, embodied atomic anxiety. Manga and anime explored themes of apocalyptic destruction and rebirth. The bombs became a rupture in Japanese history, dividing everything into before and after. For individual Japanese, the psychological journey from atomic shock to acceptance took different forms. Some found meaning in rebuilding, others remained permanently traumatized. Many simply tried to forget, to focus on the future rather than the incomprehensible past. But all carried the knowledge that everything they had believed could be wrong, that certainties could be vaporized as quickly as cities. The atomic bombs didn't just shock Japan into surrender. They shocked an entire culture into questioning its fundamental assumptions. The psychological impact rippled through generations, shaping how Japanese thought about war, technology, progress, and mortality. The instant transformation from fanatic resistance to complete surrender wasn't just military pragmatism, it was a collective psychological break from one reality to another. This is perhaps the atomic bomb's most lasting impact on Japan, not the physical destruction, which was rebuilt, not even the radiation deaths, which eventually ended, but the psychological shattering of certainty. In 72 hours, the Japanese learned that their leaders could be wrong, their god emperor was mortal, their spirit couldn't overcome science, and their nation could be erased. It was knowledge that once gained could never be unlearned. The Japanese phrase, shikata ga nai, meaning it cannot be helped, became the expression of atomic age acceptance. But beneath this resignation lay deeper currents. The shock of the atomic bombs had taught Japan that the unthinkable was possible, that tomorrow could bring weapons beyond imagination, that no belief system could stand against the fundamental forces of the universe. Modern Japan carries this psychological inheritance, the economic miracle, the commitment to peace, the complicated relationship with nuclear power, all stem partly from those 72 hours in August 1945, when atomic fire revealed the limits of human certainty and the terrible potential of human knowledge. For the survivors who still tell their stories, the psychological impact remains immediate. They don't speak of strategy or politics, but of the moment when the world changed, when a flash brighter than the sun taught them that everything they knew was wrong, and that humanity had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The atomic bombs ended World War II, but their psychological explosion continues to reverberate. They didn't just shock Japan into surrender, they shocked humanity into the atomic age, where the power to create and destroy had reached divine proportions, wielded by mortal hands. The Japanese were simply the first to experience this new reality, transformed from warriors to witnesses in the time it took uranium atoms to split.